In this video, we are going to be looking at the union all operator in SQL Server. Now, we're going to also be looking at how we might want to order this, as well as some security notes as well. So we're going to be using the same tables that we were using in our join series. And in table 1 and table 2, at the beginning of this example, we have to understand that the schema is identical. So there's an integer for ID, there's a varchar 1 for letter, and there's a varchar 5 for val. And so that means that these two tables are going to be very easy to do a union all because they align. That is not always the case when we actually do this, and we'll see an example of this in a second, but that's not always the case when we do this. So when we do a select star from table 1, we do our union all here, and we select star from table 2, we see that it overlaps nicely. We get this 1 through 4 from table 1, and we get this 3 through 6 from table 2. And so because, again, these are the same data types, we have no issue, okay? Now, what would happen if we selected, let's say, we were going to do a union, and we selected ID from table 1, and we selected val from table 1, but after our union, we selected val from table 2, and we selected ID from table 2. So let's see what happens when we do that. So we have this ID and val from table 1 in this order, and we have val and ID. So we flipped it around for table 2. And we see we get this failure, right? So the union order has an effect. For those of you who've worked in object-oriented programming, and some of you have used libraries like AutoMapper, etc., where you have tools that are intelligent enough to figure out the column types and names and like align it together, this is not how this works, okay? So you do need to specify the order correctly, and that might be a little confusing. I know with one of the object-oriented developers in the past I've worked with, that was part of the confusion for him. It's like, well, doesn't it just align? And it's like, no, it doesn't make sense, right? It's very straightforward. You have to specify the correct order. At least for now, there might be a version of SQL Server in the future that is smarter than the current versions. So at least as of the recording date of this video. The other thing as well is that when we talk about union, there's what I call like data types. Like data types are, if we think about a tiny int, a small int, an int, and a big int, those are all integer types if we think about it, right? They're not all ints, but they are all integer types in the sense that they all fall into that category. And we see this example here as well because table 1 and table 5, they do not have the exact same schema if we think about it. Like, for instance, this is int and this is big int. This is varchar 1, this is varchar 10, this is varchar 5, and this is varchar 25, right? Well, when we do the union, we see it comes out correctly. Oh, in other words, there's no error, there's no clash. Well, it's because these are like data types, right? Varchar 10 is still a varchar, varchar 25 is still a varchar, and big int and int are both integer types. And so it does come out that way. I would definitely, for the record, experiment with this when you're looking at like numeric, decimal, etc., because this is something where you really want to make sure if you're unioning tables before it ever gets into production, and in development that is, you want to make sure that the data types that you're unioning are going to line up if you're going to use this operator. There will be another example next week in which we'll be covering some of this as well. And then, of course, the other thing with union, which often, sometimes, not always, but sometimes gets overlooked, is just permissions. And it's because a lot of times when we're developing, we'll have permissions to everything, but it's possible in, like, say, a production or higher level environment that the user that's doing the union doesn't have permission to, let's say, one of the objects. So keep in mind that if we're doing a union, there has to be permissions to both objects. So let's say select star from table 2, in this case, the user has access to. We do a union all with table 2. The problem is the user doesn't have access to table 2, and we get this error. So we want to make sure that the person who is executing this has access to both objects. As far as an example of where we might use unions, there's a lot, especially in reports, unpivots, stuff like that. One that I've seen too as well, it relates to error logs. Sometimes you'll have, let's say, a database error log, an application error log, and an API error log. So let's just contrive an example right here where our database error log has a code, an error code, let's say, an error date, and an error message. But our application and our API error log only have a error date and an error message, right? Well, let's say that we want to go ahead and add a code to the API error log as well as the application error log. There isn't one, but let's say because we want it to be demarcated, we want to have a code added. We could do a union if those are all stored in tables. What we would do is we would come up with a code for the API error log and the application error log, and let's say, for in the case of the application error log, we selected 99, meant it came from the application, we would do select 99 as error code, and then of course we would select the error date, the error message, we would union all to select star from the database error log table, right? And that would overlap perfectly. It wouldn't if we tried to union all and the database had an error code column, but the application did not. But we can contrive one, and that's another thing to keep in mind. We don't have to necessarily have, if the two tables don't line up, we can contrive a column that exist, even if it's a blank, even if it's null, so that we can do a union all if we need to. So that's an example where I've seen union all used as well, but it can be very convenient. But keep in mind, we need to note the data types, and we also need to note the permissions, and next week we'll be looking at some other examples.